I'm saying, dudes, this is the extinction threshold for farming in our county at this point. And actually, in terms of the results of that study, the farmers were talking about public perception as really almost a deal breaker. And
Really?
so
More than weather and flooding and climate change and all these things
Almost.
that they felt was what was pushing them to the brink of extinction.
yeah.
This is the Real Food, Real People podcast.
Gigi Berardi is a scientist, a researcher, a professor, and a farmer, and a bunch of other things, including an author. And we're going to talk about her book in our conversation today here on the Real Food, Real People podcast. I'm Dylan Honcoop. This is my continuing journey all over Washington State to get to know the real people behind our food and the people, in this case, researching and learning about our farming community and what its future could look like, good or bad. It's interesting. This week, the conversation brings us right to Whatcom County, where I grew up, and talking with an academic, a researcher from the city, so to speak, from the university in our county, Western Washington University, who's actually worked with my dad up in rural North Whatcom County. He's a red raspberry grower on research projects. So it's bringing these worlds together, someone who I met through my farmer dad, but she's got an incredible story to share coming from Hollywood and becoming a kind of a farming and sustainability guru, the things that she shares about the future and what she calls the extinction threshold for farming here in Washington and beyond is pretty troubling, and it's an important conversation to listen to. Again, her name is Gigi Berardi. She's a professor at Western Washington University, a farmer as well, and so many other things that we'll hear about in the conversation today. Our sponsors are the Dairy Farmers of Washington. You can find them online at wadairy.org. Check out their virtual farm tour there, and they have all kinds of stories and great information, not only about the delicious dairy products that come from Washington State, but also about the people that produce them. Of course, that's what we think is so important here on the podcast as well, is the humans behind our food. It doesn't just, our food in Washington State that we produce here doesn't just come from a machine. It comes from real people and hardworking families. Also, Mana Insurance Group, speaking about families, that's what they're all about, is helping protect you and your family's financial future, if you think about it. Because you think about it, insurance in terms of dealing with things when they go wrong, well, that can really harm your financial future if you don't have a plan. And so that's what they do, is have a plan in advance at Mana Insurance Group to make sure you have things in place to protect yourself should something, if and when something unexpected happens. ManaInsuranceGroup.com. Check them out online. Also want to mention this week is the Great Washington Shakeout. Go to shakeout.org/Washington. We are in earthquake country. It may not be Hollywood or California here, but we have lots of small earthquakes all the time. And of course, there's always that threat of, and we don't know when, but the big one is coming one day. Do you have a plan? Do you know what you're going to do? There's a big drill coming up Thursday, the 21st, at 10:21 a.m. The date is 10:21. The time is 10:21 a.m. Drop, cover, and then, do you remember the third thing? Hold on. It used to just be drop and cover. Now it's hold on, too, because it's important if everything's shaking around to keep your cover over your head and protect you from anything falling in the case of an earthquake. There's so many other things to be prepared for and do as well, and you can learn more about those via the Great Washington Shakeout, the drill happening this Thursday at 10:21 a.m. and or online, where you can get more details about the drill and the event at shakeout.org/Washington, the Great Washington Shakeout. So you are passionate about food and farming. Why? What drives that? How did that start for you?
I grew up in an Italian household, and so food was everything.
Yeah.
And so every Sunday night we had huge dinners that had been cooked for the entire weekend, and we had people and friends, and maybe not so many friends, but people we needed to connect to over for dinner. The farming's super interesting because my mother was from Oklahoma, and she literally was of the Grapes of Wrath era.
Wow.
Yeah, and in fact, I have first cousins, really, and who have just died recently, first cousins who came to California in covered wagons. Yeah, so it was that close. So she hated farming, and so I knew nothing about farming. We barely had a lemon tree in our backyard in Southern California. And for graduate school, I ended up at Cornell University, thinking that I wanted to study animals, because I love animals.
Yeah.
Like, who doesn't? But anyway, and started in wildlife biology and resource management, but I wasn't so interested. What I was really interested in was every single other thing that was happening at that land-grant college. And I learned what a land-grant college was, and people thought I was, strange, 22 years old. Everyone was like 10 years older than me in natural resources and female, back then. And I was so interested in farming. Cornell had a 1-credit class that had been required, and it was the last year it was offered where you actually milked a cow. And then it was discontinued. And so I was always interested in science, so I became very interested in the scientific applications in agriculture. I was so impressed to see the farm boys and the farm girls, a few of them, that were in classes, and, what kind of farms they had come from and their passion in wanting to keep on going in terms of the family business. And then I started to take animal nutrition and kind of senior level classes in that. And of course, dairy nutrition was really the big thing there at Cornell, and farm business management. And so now today I'm teaching business and sustainability classes, but I'm introducing farm and food into those classes at Western. And rural sociology too. And I was interested in all of it. It was fascinating to me. And it's how we get our food.
So you were a city girl essentially at that point, coming into the world of farming via academia.
I was born in Hollywood. Yes.
Wow.
And I was in the movies when I was little and TV. I mean,
Oh,
I
really?
was just totally Holly weirded out. Yeah.
What were you in?
Well, I was an extra, okay?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
sometimes I had larger parts, but Hello, Dolly
Oh,
with
really?
Barbara Streisand. Yeah. And then there was a cult film called Wild in the Streets. When I was 11, I was in that. But mostly it was TV, like the John Forsythe show. I was on Ben Casey, which was one of the first kind of medical shows. I was a very, very little girl then. And, I was...
So coming from that world and then entering the world of farming, what began to strike you about where food comes from? And when did you start to link that together, even like with your Italian heritage and the big meals and, the focus on culinary art, that's part of the culture that you come from? When did you start to feel like you were bringing that together?
I mean, I guess I recognized that farming is hard, and that I was so impressed that people were trying to figure it out. And I never had a female professor in any of my classes.
Wow.
And they were older white men, okay. And but that's who I was studying. And then I must admit that some of them had kind of an international focus. And at that time in the world, it was the great so-called world food crisis in the 1970s, and so-called energy crisis too. And so we were facing limited resources. And I was just really interested to see how they were figuring it out. And I must admit, I was a little rebellious. So I was in a very conservative department of conservation, where they had easily identified all the world's problems, many of which related to so-called overpopulation. And I just knew it was more complicated than that. And I couldn't believe that they were comfortable in their silos and not interested in looking at agricultural economics and rural sociology, and where there was a lot of honesty and truth. And I didn't necessarily agree with it with everyone, but I sure knew that it was important information for me to have.
So that's where you began to think deeply about sustainability.
Yeah, and
It wasn't a buzzword back then as much.
not only that, neither was organic farming.
Yeah.
So what happened was I became interested in another rebel who was his name was David Pimentel. He's died recently, and he was arch enemy, let's just say, of in agriculture, kind of, but also in my world of conservation too. What he did was he pioneered the idea of a energy audit, let's say, for agriculture or other farming systems or for anything. And he was an entomologist. And I hooked up with him because I just liked his approach as a vehicle for talking about resource issues. And so somehow I landed on the idea of doing something on organic farming, but organic farming was hardly a term then. And whenever I talked to a faculty member, I always had to use the term so-called organic farming. I could never say I was working on organic farming because they would say, oh, what's that? Contains carbon. So my first research was looking at conventional and organic wheat production. And wheat production doesn't use many chemicals, really, compared to perhaps other crops. And so I did an energy and economic analysis on that, and it just opened up for me questions about fiscal solvency in organic farming and even in conventional farming. And then my next project was a PhD, which was funded by then it was called the Agricultural Conservation and Stabilization Service, and also Soil Conservation Service, where I studied soil. So I became interested not just in social dimensions, but the soil chemistry dimensions too, and challenges farmers had. And in upstate New York, there's a tier in the north, on the boundary with Canada. It's called the North Country, and it's dairy farmers.
Yeah.
So I first became super interested in dairy farming. It's dairy farmers on very poor soils. There's hardly any soil. There's a lot of rock outcrop, very poor drainage, if anything, hardly any outlets. And what I tried to do was, what I studied was drainage, was subsurface and surface drainage, to see how that might improve the economics and the energy efficiency of dairy farmers in that particular area of New York with challenges.
That sounds very challenging.
Oh, it was super interesting because then I was like maybe 24 when I started my PhD from Hollywood, and I'm walking into these farms, and they're like, "Who are you?" So I got a lot of experience being humble and just saying, I am stupid. You're going to have to educate me. And they opened up to me, and I was able to do this study.
That humility, I think, is so important. It needs to come from both sides, too, from farmers, from academics, from people coming from, I think so. There's so much that people can learn from each other if they drop the, judgments and listen.
It's one planet. Yeah. I mean, it's one county. It's one watershed.
Yeah.
And, I don't know. I don't want to fast forward, but I want to say that for the master's thesis, I was able to find Old Order Mennonite farmers for my sample. And I have to tell you, it was impossible to find Old Order Amish farmers who were organic. I felt like there wasn't a single, despite public perceptions, not appearances, but despite public perception. They weren't farming organically, and I found one Old Order Mennonite family, and they took me into their home. So I was able to put on like a little uniform and live with them for a while. But let me tell you that the other Old Order Mennonite farmers in their community thought they were weird because we went over to their houses. And so that was a real eye-opener to me. And now that family, the mother and father, has 78 grandchildren.
Wow.
And great-grandchildren, yeah. So, but anyway, I think the humility piece is important. And so a few years ago, we did... we got some money from the USDA to study small and mid-sized farming for prosperity. It was a prosperity grant. So how can small scale and mid scale farms, which is a pretty gracious definition, a range
Yeah.
of what constitutes small and mid sized, become more prosperous. And we parlayed that into a resilience study. And I just really didn't want to use the word sustainability. And what I like to say is, I know this is a little dramatic, but it'd be easier for me to lay down in the middle of I-5 than to get a farmer in the county to come to a sustainability study that Western is putting together. There's like 6 parts of that sentence that doesn't fit with what they're interested in, the way it's pitched. And so we did the resilience study, and your father was part of that. And it was in Snohomish and San Juan and Whatcom County. And what we found is in writing disaster scenarios. So we had 4 disaster scenarios. One was rapid urbanization, which is a big threat to farming.
Certainly.
In many ways. And then we had energy spikes, and a spike in energy prices. We had climate change, general climate change, and flooding, seasonal flooding. And the point is, with those disaster scenarios, well, first of all, the main point is it was hard to write and pitch a disaster scenario to a farmer that was really a disaster scenario, because farmers really learn how to maneuver around that and how to negotiate these disasters, which are just commonplace. It's not something that's made up at Western when a couple people write a scenario. Okay, so it was hard to convince people it was serious. But we did. So that means that we had to go farther and farther out in terms of the climate change scenario. The seasonal floods had to be like a Pineapple Express, which we did have actually while we were writing it. So that was one thing. The second thing is that, and this is why I like the idea of resilience, which I talk about in the book, is that it's something we can all get our heads around, whether we're small, and I know small and mid-sized doesn't really mean very much. I realize that, but whether we're, we have the family cow, or, 5 acres of permaculture, or we've got, 90 head of cattle we're milking, or, whatever that means, or larger, much larger. And we did have farmers in the sample who had 2,000 cows that they were milking, okay? So, which was pushing the idea of mid. But anyway, we're all affected by seasonal rains. We're all affected by that flooding. And so we all should be, and the farmers were interested in asking questions about, well, what's happening in the upper reaches of the watershed, and who's winning and who's losing with that. Yeah. And then what does it mean for us? And then your dad starts asking questions, about, discussions that are being had in the county about, water banking, basically. Yeah. And so it's all connected. It's all good. So that was really interesting. And I think humility was a part of that. Yeah. And what we did was we put together a graphic, and I pitched the idea of an extinction threshold that they talk about all the time in wildlife biology. And I'm saying, dudes, this is the extinction threshold for farming in our county at this point. And actually, in terms of the results of that study, the farmers were talking about public perception as really almost a deal breaker. And
really? So more than weather and flooding and climate change and all these things
almost.
That they felt was what was pushing them to the brink of extinction.
Yeah. Almost, because that's also feeding into these kind of inane regulations that that people, I hate saying the farmers, it sounds like, I don't know, that people in this study were coming up with, like, one inspector comes in one day and the hinges have to be here, and the next inspector comes in and they need to be here. Yeah. But public perception is also a part of that in terms of, who we're voting into office and why. And so we did that, and then I thought, how stupid to use this money for like a report that people in this study aren't going to read. So we made a film. And so we made a film called Our Farms Are at Risk, and it was a 2.5-minute film, and then we made a 30-second version. And actually, I think in that film, Dory Belisle was in it,
Bellwood
and
Acres.
Larry
Yeah.
Stapp, and Larry Stapp and Troy Lenson and Debbie Vanderveen, and we made a 30-second version and we put it on Seattle TV. And I'm like, people don't care about farming. Let's just do this. Our farms are at risk, 30-second. And it's like, Larry said, you want to know what the problem is? The real problem is people. People are our problem. And you'd think, like, I don't know if Larry would say that, but he meant it, and even though he's a very people person and he's very loyal to his constituency. But that's just it. And then the film, the 2.5-minute version, won an ADDIE Award, which is the American Marketing Association. Like, an agriculture film has won an award in marketing, but we were marketing kind of like farmers' plight and what we need to do.
So, what other than the award, what other feedback did you get from like the general public? What did people say about it?
They were, we had music that had to be recomposed for the 30-second version. It was daunting. I think at the end, what we say is our farms are at risk. There's a slide, and then the farmresilience.org project for more information. I think people were saddened. People were surprised. I mean, I showed it in classes with my students. I showed it at Huxley College. I showed it whenever I was giving a talk. And I think in that 2.5 minutes and 30 seconds, people were shocked at the challenges farmers have.
I guess, I keep hearing this more and more. I see more than I ever have in my whole life that this extinction threshold is real, and it's not nearly as far away as even the farming community sometimes thinks, because they have to be optimists, right? It's always, next year. Well, when do you get to the point when there's no next year? And then I also think, when I talk with people outside of the farming community, it's like, is it really, that bad? And you're saying, based on this, that it is. Like, how close is that extinction threshold?
Close. And so then what do we do with that? Bummer. Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in what comes next. And so, I mean, not that you're not, I'm not saying that, but like, this is what comes next. Why do we need to keep farmers farming? And I say open space. I mean, there's other reasons, but I'm just trying to get to I'm just trying to find common ground with critics or with, I don't know, people who aren't thinking thoughtfully. Open space. We need that open space. And the other thing that comes from that is infrastructure, especially for our dairy county, and once that infrastructure is lost, then it's really difficult to get it back in terms of dairy farming. And so open space and all the ecological services that are associated with open space is invaluable, and for no other reason that we've got to keep that going. And so that relates to zoning, and that relates to support at different levels. I won't use the word subsidy because I know that gets overused and misused, but especially now with the current farm bill. But I think that it is real, and if you don't think it's real. What it means is that we're getting our food from somewhere else. And then these are other people's problems in other countries. One of the classes I teach, I'm able to teach a global learning program because I do this eco-gastronomy kind of farming program in Switzerland and Italy, but also in Mexico, which is challenging. And we go to Mexico and we can see basically that there's no free lunch, which is a very special and important concept in environmental science. There's no free lunch, and so we're getting our winter broccoli from these valleys in the central part of Mexico, Guanajuato State, and I'm able to take students to the villages and through no fault of anyone's own, but some kind of plan of some sort. I mean, the bedrock there is loaded with fluoride and arsenic. And so you start to deplete the water table and you're going to find a heavier concentration of those toxic metals, in the water, and it's harming children. And that's what agriculture there, broccoli agriculture, gets us. And I honestly, I feel more confident and competent talking with farmers in my county, in Whatcom County, and taking students on field trips in my county. And if there's something that's going on in terms of practices that they've got questions about, they can ask right here. I'd love to have the broccoli grown in Whatcom County, and I bet there's people who would love to grow it on some kind of scale.
But the reality is, broccoli is not a high dollar, high value cash crop. And so many people love their veggies. Well, most veggies, you go to the store, they aren't that expensive. And it's just pennies on the dollar that make it back to the farmer, so it's really tough to make it. And I've heard this from multiple people now, even here on the podcast and outside. So then it's like, why would you do that here? Because you would go broke really fast.
Right. And because of that, so you've just kind of answered your own question in some respects. So okay, given that, we look at dairy farming in the county. There's a problem with dairy farming. This is a beautiful climate for dairy farms. We used to have a lot more. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the
hundreds more.
The extinction threshold. And so we're looking at a kind of farming that we should support with the dairy farming, where it is what I call in the book whole, meaning integrated, meaning it's a mixed livestock crop for most situations, where that manure is kind of recycled, if you will. Yeah. And I know I'm not supposed to use the word waste, Troy Linson says, so I won't. But
because a farmer views it as nutrients, as something with value.
Absolutely. So that's going to be what we're growing here. It's not going to be broccoli. But then we've got Skagit, county. Yeah. So why is they producing 40 to 70% of the world's seed of 13 crops, when I don't know, maybe that could be broccoli? Well, you have to follow the money.
Right.
Obviously the value isn't there. But it's complicated. These are the kinds of questions you have to ask.
Well, and they have the infrastructure still somewhat, even though it's gone away quite a bit. But in Skagit County, there's still some infrastructure. You go back to talking about what's in the community, and once you lose it, you can't get it back. That's the story here in Whatcom County, because I remember when I was a kid, my dad grew peas, and there were all kinds of other vegetables and stuff, because we had the facilities to take them and, get them into freezers or bags or cans or whatever, the canneries. Well, those are gone. Yeah. How do you ever bring them back?
Yeah, no kidding. So, when I wrote Food Wise, originally my main goal was to address what I call fierce food beliefs. So it was the fierce food beliefs about two different worlds. One world was farming, and I call that our shared world of food. I call farming our shared world of food. And then what we eat, our choices in terms of what we actually put into our bodies, and I call that our personal world of food. And they surely affect each other. Yeah. That is true in many ways. But that's how I divided it up, because my task was to talk about all farming, all things, all people, all foods.
So I'm thinking, even just looking at your book, I'm thinking about being in your position as you're planning this. What a daunting, it's such a tip of the iceberg. I could just keep digging deeper and deeper into all these issues.
I know. I don't think the word permaculture appears in there once, and I teach permaculture. It just wasn't part of the story. And so I just had to, but it is. Don't get me wrong. Those of you in permaculture out there. Yeah. But the story I'm trying to tell in terms of weaving together all of these different strands and people not being threatened in terms of their food choices by trying to understand what I call wise, food wise. And so the W is for whole, and that means kind of integrated forms. Honestly, that is sneaky speak for dairy farms, for mixed crop and livestock farms. And my students, and I can relate, I can understand that in large part, perhaps because of exposure or lack of it, are skeptical of complicated operations like this. So this is one reason why it's important to use it as a vehicle for discussion in my classes. But anyway, that's what I mean by whole. But like broccoli from Mexico, no, I don't. know anything about that, but it is affordable, and it's even organic broccoli from but anyway, okay, whole, and then I is for informed. Just be informed. Just get as much information as you can, and try and address confirmation bias, which is you only get information and accept information and relay information on things about things that you already believe in, that kind of reinforce what you believe in.
Right.
That gets us nowhere.
Echo chamber.
Yeah, exactly. And then S is sustainable, but that was also that. That means also sustainable us, like our personal budgets. We have to recognize that. One of the things I did was like put together a dinner from 7-Eleven, so sustainable budget, sustainable planet. And I prefer the word resilience, but it doesn't fit with wise. Yeah. And then E for experience. And I'm like, my gosh, that's the most important thing. That is getting out there and doing something for yourself. So in one of the classes I teach, there's 130 students, and I know it's difficult with COVID, but I put it all remote, so it's possible. They have to cook. So there's assignments where they have to cook. Usually we've got 40 students cooking for 120 students. And we do that like 4 or 5 times during the quarter. And it doesn't have to be WIS. It doesn't have to be all of that, or what we call FLOSS, fresh, local, organic, sustainable, seasonal. It doesn't have to be all 5 of those. It can be just like one of those, fresh, and just like experience what that is. Experience the expense of it. Experience the complication of cooking it. So they cook for themselves, they forage for themselves, and that's experience. Experience is information is like secondhand experience. It's not as good, but the experience is really what makes us. What gives us practical wisdom. So that is the ability to know what to do, and when to do it. And that's important for hospitals making difficult decisions, criminal systems in terms of young offenders, teachers doing the right thing when a student can't show up, and our choices about food.
So before I forget, the name of the book is Food Wise. By you. Where can people find it if they want to read this and delve in themselves?
Well, I was lucky to have a very nice publisher, North Atlantic Books, and Penguin Random House distributes it. So it's on. If you just look up Food Wise, one word, not 2 words. Food Wise. And my name, Gigi, maybe even just the first name, Gigi. It's on like 50 or 60 websites around the world. You'll be able to find it. I was going to say Michael Pollan in the end actually endorsed the book. Maybe I shouldn't say that. And he said, Gigi, I can't find it. This is ridiculous. I'm like, Michael, it's one word. But that brings up the interesting question of who endorsed this book.
Yeah.
And many different people, farmers, big farmers endorse this book. Vegans endorse this book. Fierce meat eaters endorse this book. And I love that. I think that there's, because I'm just saying, just consider this acronym, Yeah. And honestly, in the second part of the book, I talk about science. In a way, it's actually an ode to science, saying that there's something here. It's like way back at Cornell. I was fascinated by the science. So, for example, I take on fats. And I said, look, if you look at the theoretical work of this MIT researcher, you'll see that there's some very interesting research on what saturated fat does in our bodies. And not the processed, polyunsaturated fats, but actually animal fats, and coconut and palm oil. But it's worth looking at. Or for sugar. Look. Nah, it's not just like high fructose corn syrup in those corn farmers or whatever. It's like fructose. It's like, let's look at what sugar does. And, why is it that giving your kid a can of soda is like a can of beer? According to this one epidemiologist. Maybe you don't agree. So, but it's worth looking at the research. Or why artisan food is so difficult to do sensory taste profiles on because it's not consistent, and we value consistency. So
Right.
most of the research in sensory taste science is on, basically commodities, I guess,
Yeah.
or kind of industrial food, which is interesting. It's neither good nor bad. It's just interesting.
So you're an author of the book Food Wise. You're also a professor and researcher. How would you describe yourself? What are all the titles and hats that you wear?
Like on my medical forms, I say I say professor writer.
Yeah.
And but I also have been so privileged. I've been like milking dairy cows, like hand milking for maybe 10 years. But 6 years ago, we got our own sheep. And so I hand milk our sheep. We'll have 4 ewes next season and make cheese. And then I teach the art and science of cheese with an ecotoxicologist at Western. And so it's a kind of a hands-on class, but there's a lot of science there, again, on the art and science of cheese. If we want to look at nutrient management from cheese-producing plants, we'll talk to Lindsay and Jeff Slevin at, Twin Sisters, Creamery, which is fascinating. So there's that. I'm an EMT.
Oh,
So
wow.
I became an EMT last year. I went through the training.
Congrats,
Oh my gosh.
that's awesome.
Yeah,
what
all
a
those-
time in the world to become an EMT, but
Yeah.
it's needed.
Yeah. In fact, COVID had just started when I was doing my practicals at St. Joe's. And in the San Juan Islands. And I'm an EMT. And so I'm a first responder. And I'm a mom. And I have.
Author, researcher, professor, scientist, farmer, EMT.
Yeah.
How do you have time to do all of this?
I have 25-year-old twins. I'm writing a novel, and I threw the first
Wow.
100,000 words away because it was a Wikipedia article and not very interesting.
Yeah.
So that was a hard experiment, and I've got about 40,000 words now.
I've heard that it's harder to write a novel than it is nonfiction.
Oh my gosh, it is for me.
You would think, it's counterintuitive because you think, well, you're just making it up so you can take it wherever you want. But to be true to reality and resonate.
Yeah, and
Novels are
really
harder.
dive into a character.
Yeah.
I'm learning German, and 2 years ago I had a sabbatical in Switzerland, in Dornach, Switzerland, at the Goetheanum. And the Goetheanum is the kind of seat of biodynamic farming and Waldorf education, and I was just curious. I'm a curious person, curiosity-seeking person,
Yeah.
and so I was there and muddled through in German, and I'm doing better by taking elementary German classes now, but it does take up a lot of time.
I kicked myself so hard for not paying more attention when I was younger in language learning.
Yeah.
Other second, third, whatever, other languages, because the younger you are, the easier it is to learn, they tell me.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Well, I speak Italian, and I can get by in a couple other languages, but it's embarrassing.
So you teach at the Huxley College of the Environment at Western Washington University, which, honestly, as someone who grew up in the farming community here in Whatcom County, I grew up in the North County, agricultural, rural, conservative, Bellingham's to the south, Western, Huxley. That's known as like the diametric, opposite.
Right? Yeah.
But what's your experience there? And you talked about even like, talking about dairy or issues around dairy farming, be a conversation starter. What are those conversations? What is being talked about in the college?
For starters, there many students are looking at vegetarian diets, vegetarian food preferences. They are concerned about dairy, which is one reason why in the book I talk about saturated fats,
Yeah.
because one of the beliefs, though, with all that is that we're all different. And it's super not popular for me to say this. So I say it with humility, but and offer maybe we're really not that different. And that's risky for me because it's not a popular thing to say. And then from that, I say, let's look at what nutrients constitute our diet, and let's look at the fat load in our diet and fiber load in our diet. It is, and show how it's all related. And so they've got ideas. I mean, I've got ideas too about what their food preferences are, and there's in general a skepticism about animal agriculture. And
what do you think drives that? What's informing that? And I'm not saying it's never a valid concern, because I think, especially in the university context, that's where you're supposed to be challenging those kinds of things and digging deep. What is the truth and questioning? But when students come in with those questions, where does that come from? Do they have experience with any farming?
Okay, and let me give you another example, which is, so I take students to a farm, happens to be in the San Juan Islands on Lopez Island, called S&S Homestead. And that farmer is deeply religious, but he's also deeply spiritual too. Yeah. And he has published some papers on the sacredness of farming. And people, I'll stop like farmers and students, I'll just say people. And people have a hard time even reading the paper and kind of appreciating another person's view on where they're seeing the spiritual in their farming. So, and you ask, where's that come from? And I'm like, because like their parents are only like 45 or 50 or whatever. They're not like 75 or 80. And many of those parents are not so-called religious. I have no idea. Yeah. So I've not really been able to wrap my head around that this fear of religion, I kind of get that, but the fear of the spirituality component in that is very interesting to me. So the natural predilection to being skeptical of animal agriculture, I think it's all wrapped up in perception of fats, for example. I do.
Nutrition,
nutrition in terms of their personal choices.
What about sustainability and the environment and those kinds of things?
They're not seeing manure as a nutrient, and so they're seeing it as a waste. And I just think we have a very proud and interesting history of 25 years ago or 30 years ago. I mean, important history where, there was a wake-up call in the county, and, things changed in terms of nutrient management. And,
all across the state.
And the paperwork that was needed to get to nutrient management. And so there have been some wake-up calls, but everyone's working to keep those nutrients where they need to be. And I don't know. It's why my job is always fresh, even though I've been doing this for decades, because people are coming to it fresh, and we just have to see that farmers are stewards. Let me just say that there are some issues that are. I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on facilitating discussions among skeptics or among those with fierce food beliefs. I don't, in terms of labor. And I know you and I have talked about this a teeny bit once or twice. I'm still working on this. And even in the book, in Foodwise, I talk about kind of the history of part-time labor, kind of like a potted version of that, and kind of related to legislation, let's say. Without bringing up particular cases, but it's not enough. And I'll be honest, I couldn't get people in labor to endorse the book. And I said, but look, I'm asking these questions, I'm trying to present it, but it wasn't enough. I didn't go far enough. And in the county, I'm still, I'm convinced that I can be part of the discussion. And I know that some of these issues are quite polarized, and I understand why on both sides. And
because it's about people's lives and about human dignity and decency, right?
Yeah. And I just think, without jumping into that, since I don't really have a good way to kind of frame some of the discussion, I think starting with with the commitment to nutrient recycling,
Yeah.
starting with other aspects of farm practices is important. Maybe it's even so before going on to labor practices, maybe a first thing is looking at, for example, water management in the county, which is a good discussion to have, and what people are doing in terms of getting information, let's say, on water availability, water cycling, and water management, and talking to each other. And the tribes, the so many sovereign nations that we share this land with, and I say that because I taught at Northwest Indian College, and I think when I was teaching, there were 26 tribal nations represented. I think farmers are respectful, and there are some unanswered questions, and there's sides there. But
and talk about a culture and a history, a legacy of food too, between tribal families and food from the land and from the sea. I mean, it's a huge, rich tradition there as well.
Yeah. So it's just interesting to me that there are ways to talk and meet, and not that there's agreements very much. I mean, always, but it's a work in progress. Yeah. It's a good dynamic work in progress, and as long as we recognize, the tribal nations as sovereign nations and what their rights are. I mean, and I think farmers are starting with that as a basic principle. Yeah. We can have discussions. The labor practices is I'm working on that with my students. I'm talking about.
Well, everything really. Life is a work in progress.
It is a work in progress.
But thank you for sharing about your book and about your background. It's a really cool story where you've come from, being, growing up in Hollywood to here in Northwest Washington State, all about food and sustainability and the environment that we steward around us. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say one thing, that I'm actually working with Mother Noella Marcellino, who's now the Mother Prioress at Our Lady of the Rock on Shaw Island. And she is the cheese nun. She hates to be called the cheese nun. But she's just a wonderful kind of life lesson and partner for me. And I think her story is quite interesting, that she was charged at her abbey, Regina Laudis, in Bethlehem, Connecticut, to kind of get the cheese making going. And they used a lot of wood in their wood vats and wood paddles, and some of that came from France. And all of a sudden, she was in the middle of a controversy about the microbiology of the cheese, of the milk, and of the cheese paste, and the relationship to wood. But she has been parlayed into this heroine. In fact, she just addressed slow food, cheese, and bras. She addressed the biannual conference on cheese, and they were trying to get her to say that wood is awesome and raw is the best and fresh, and she was like, And she said, I think we make choices in terms of producing fresh milk cheeses, but you have to be careful particularly with these kinds of cheeses. And we are using wood, but you have to be careful in these dimensions. And I think it's always very, very complicated.
That's what we find every time. There's no all or nothing answer almost ever.
Oh my gosh, that is the bottom line. And here in the United States, okay, I know this is a gross generalization, but
people want those binary answers
with my people.
Yes or no?
Yeah,
it's never that simple.
But it's not exactly right. It's not meat, no meat.
Yeah.
It's not water, no water.
Yeah.
It's not. It just isn't.
Oftentimes it's not organic or not organic. No. What about transitional? What about
transition? What about a little bit of meat? What about
exactly.
And I just have to stick with that. That's what I just firmly believe in, that is how we remain humble and respect each other.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much with us.
This is the Real Food, Real People podcast. These are the stories of the people who grow your food.